right, welcome back everybody to another Sunday School Teacher Workshop. So this week, moving on past Ezra and getting over into Zechariah. It's our one and only look. Wow, okay, so my iPad's going to do some funky stuff. Hold on. I'm sorry. Getting our one and only look at Zechariah. Let me just do this. We'll get there momentarily. I don't know why it gets glitchy like this. There we go. All right. So what I'm doing is just taking this approach, unlike what I've done in previous lessons, where I've attempted to try to take the scroll of this minor prophet that we're dealing with and trying to break it down into more digestible bites so that we can try to give our students something of an overview of what's really going on in the scroll. I'm rather just taking chapter 9 and splitting it into two parts, because as you saw from the title screen that I flashed up a second ago, that we're only dealing with verse 9 through 17 or the rest of this chapter. But I think it's essential for us to, in order to have proper context here, to work through the first part of the chapter to make sure we're getting what Zechariah has been building up to at this particular moment in time. Because, of course, when we read Zechariah 9, verse 9, the first thing that pops up into our mind is any one of the gospel passages where Jesus is going through what we call the triumphal entry moment in the gospel narrative. And he has saddled up that donkey after he sent his disciples to go and gather it. And then, of course, the gospel writer is making it overtly obvious that this was a prophecy that Zechariah had spoken. And now comes this moment when Jesus, riding on the back of that donkey, is indeed fulfilling that moment, which we too have that payoff here on the screen. But what is the significance of this from Zechariah's approach? And I think we'll actually get a lot more out of it if we tackle it from that perspective. So retitling the lesson here, A New David is welcomed into his new kingdom. So let me zoom in on this here to just work through the first half of this chapter, or what I'm calling Zechariah 9a. And I guess the cutoff point for that is roughly up to verse 8. So we're going to handle quite a bit of the text here, and I want to highlight a few things for you. So reading in Zechariah chapter 9, verses 1 and 2 and verse 5, we have this: the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach and Damascus. So these two cities are actually co-located pretty close to one another in what is currently modern-day Syria. So if you're thinking in your mind of ancient Israel as a land, more or less like a block, then up to the north by northeast is where Syria would be, and of course Hadrach and Damascus, its capital. And his hand is also against Hamath. So Hamath is another city within Syria. So all that territory sequestered up there north by northeast from Israel. And then Tyre and Sidon as well. Remember, the Lord's hand is against these lands. So Tyre and Sidon are ancient kingdoms. They were populated by the Phoenicians, and this is all of Israel's north by northwest neighboring territory. We remember that the wicked queen Jezebel was the daughter of Eshbal III, who was the king priest ruling in Tyre at the time when she was married to Ahab. Ashkelon will see it and be afraid too, so will Gaza, and they will writhe in great wrath or pain, as will Ekron. So Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron are three of the five chief cities of the kingdom of Philistia. So this is Israel's neighbors south by southwest. So you pretty much have a snapshot of nearly all the kingdoms and territories that had surrounded Israel back in the time when Israel was its own independent kingdom or conglomerate of kingdoms, with Israel, the northern kingdom, Judah, the southern kingdom, and until the Babylonians had come to town and then basically wiped all the rest of these kingdoms off the map, leaving remnants of survivors there. These kingdoms were known by those names. Now, for the most part, they aren't, and they've been divided up into territories, provinces, satrapies, depending upon which kingdom you're talking about and how they administer their kingdom. But with the Lord's hand directed against all of them, it seems that we have a picture here of Yahweh judging the nations in defense of Israel, because in this passage we have no hint, even the slightest suggestion, that Yahweh is going to be turning judgment upon his own people. Now, we have a very similar outlook in comparison to, say, Isaiah or Jeremiah, pre-exilic prophets. And in the first 27 chapters of Isaiah, you see quite a few words dedicated in similar fashion to God judging all of Israel's neighbors, but he does not spare Israel or Judah. And Jeremiah, in his day, the northern kingdom is gone, Judah is still present, and Judah is ripe for judgment because Jeremiah is tenured as a prophet during the time of Josiah, and we know that even with Josiah trying to repent on the part of the nation, God says he will not relent, and he will indeed bring judgment. So in both of those pre-exilic major prophets, we have God basically putting Israel and Judah in this cauldron with the nations, and he is going to bring his wrath against them. But again, we have no word of God expressing judgment toward Judah or his people by covenant right in this particular passage. So that's how it's developing. Let's move on. Verses 3 through 4 and then 7. So Tyre has built herself a fortress, which she was well known for. In fact, she was quite difficult to conquer. Of all the kingdoms that Babylon had come against on the western side of the Jordan River, Tyre was the one that was most relentless and basically had waited him out. By virtue of the fact there was an island directly off the coastline that they had built a series of bridges to that allowed the people to retreat and hold up in what was essentially an impregnable fortress. Although Alexander the Great was successful in actually toppling them over, it seems like rather than Tyre having rebuilt the structure, that this is a hearkening back to that moment when Tyre has more or less kind of propped herself up as being yet again a quasi-dominant power in the area because she postured where she is on the coastline and the contacts that she has all throughout the Mediterranean world with both European and African countries as her trading partners makes her a lucrative kingdom to trade with and so forth. So some of that dominance and power has been restored, but just like Judah, they are still controlled by the Persian overlords. Nonetheless, she has heaped up silver like dust and gold like the dirt of the streets. Listen, the Lord will impoverish her and cast her wealth into the sea. One could almost read in there that he will pulverize her. She will herself be consumed by fire. So, this almost seems like an inescapable judgment God is going to be bringing. I will remove the blood from Philistia's mouth. So here we are in verse 7. So if you read the context in between verse 4 and 7, you'll understand Philistia is who's being talked about here. So of course, Philistia as a kingdom is not a people of Yahweh, and so they do not have covenant revelation like Israel does. Those laws that God had given through Moses in what comprises much of the second half of Exodus and all of Leviticus that tells the people they are not to eat meat that still has the blood in it. That blood has to be completely leached out of it in order for it to be proper and fitting for clean, as in ceremonially clean, human consumption. Well, of course, Philistia, just like all the rest of the Canaanite tribes, have no kind of rules or constraints, and their gods seemingly don't care, and they gorge themselves on these kinds of things. Why this particular habit is a point of focus here is really not relevant. Point is that they are doing something that is considered to be abominable in Yahweh's sight, and so because of this, he will take these abhorrent things from between their teeth. So it sounds like God is going to judge the nations, and he will indeed humble Israel's old enemies, because for the most part, they are on even keel right along with Judah. These people have been resettled back in their land. They're not picking fights with Israel like they did in the days prior to the Babylonian captivity, when all these kingdoms were their own sovereign. Because, of course, if they do that, they realize their Persian overlords are going to come and squash that very quickly, and the consequences will not only be swift, but incredibly severe. But what happens next is a very interesting and almost scandalous turn of events, because as we finish verse 7 and move into verse 8, we seem to have this dramatic reversal of what has been projected through the chapter up to this point. Again, I would remind you, from all what we've read in these 7 verses, it seems that God is going to be bringing judgment upon all of these people, consuming them by fire, ripping the abhorrent things out of their teeth, humbling these nations. But then we get into the second half of verse 7 and all of verse 8, and this is what we're told. Then they too will become a remnant for our God. Let's be careful to pay attention to the use of pronouns here. They here does not leave off these nation groups that we've been talking about. The cities of Syria, Philistia, and the Phoenician kingdom of Tyre and Sidon. all of these people are going to become a remnant of the God of Israel. They here does not reference the ethnic descendants of Abraham within the land of Judah who have been resettled there by virtue of the edict of Cyrus and the Persian kings who continued to rule after him in the days of Zechariah. This is a explicit reference to only the Gentile nations because of the use of the word to, meaning because Judah has now been established as a remnant, planted as a seed within the land for the messianic seed to be born from. These surrounding nations that populate the old kingdoms of Syria or Aram, Damascus, Phoenicia, and Philistia are somehow going to be joined right alongside of and on equal footing to the Jewish remnant that's been restored to the land. They will become like a clan in Judah, as if they were nestled right there in the Holy Land itself. Holy, as goes city and land, is not a reference that's made by any of the Hebrew people until we get into the exilic period. The pre-exilic prophets only begin to speak of it in that time when exile will come, and they're speaking about the hope of futuristic restoration to the land. So this concept of Holy Land, Holy City begins to really take on a reality and concept or mind and theology of its own only in this exilic period. So now, Judah being holy to the Lord, we consider all of these kingdoms or people groups being nestled there as if they were a part of Judah. Recall the words that Isaiah spoke to us in Isaiah 56, the idea of all of these Israelites coming back to the land and then just being startled, waking up and finding out they have all of these children that they don't even recognize settled in the land with them. And they ask, who fathered these? And they're like, well, come on, Mom. I mean, we're your children. And essentially that's a reference to the Gentiles being gathered in alongside Israel in the period of this Messianic kingdom's arrival. And Ekron, like the Jebusites. Remember, the Jebusites, they had stayed in Jerusalem for centuries, from the days of Melchizedek potentially, all the way up until the time that David had conquered them. In the days of Joshua, maybe he wasn't able to conquer them, or he just didn't challenge them, but the Jebusites were known to already be established on Jerusalem's summit at that point. They taunted David, saying he couldn't conquer, but he did. And of course, the Jebusites seem to have acquiesced and fully embraced their overlord. You considered Ornan in 2 Chronicles. Perhaps it's maybe toward the end of 1st, I'm not quite sure. But nonetheless, he is the one who winds up settling David the threshing floor that would become the site on Mount Moriah where the temple would be built. And he had to haggle with David because he wanted to give it all to him, and not just the land. He wanted to give him his oxen that he was actually using and the wood for the threshing sledge and all of it so he could wind up making a sacrifice. And David had to basically twist his arm, make him say uncle, and say, okay, I'll take the money for the floor. But the Jebusites had become a favored people amongst the Judahites in the time that David was ruling over them and from beyond. So this becomes a picture now of the ingathering of the Gentiles into the remnant of Jewish people as a connected body. God says, I will encamp at my house as a guard against those who march back and forth. As if God now becomes a mega sentry over the land of Israel, and he's not just posting watch over his own remnant, i.e., the people who have descended from Abraham, who went off into exile and have now come back and begun to repopulate the city and rebuild the temple. He has established himself as a sentry over all of these surrounding kingdoms. And he says, no oppressor will march against them. Again, the pronoun them is the same use of they at the beginning of the verses, which doubles back to the use of the Gentiles. So God is saying he's extending his protection beyond just ethnic Israel and to these peoples as well. For now, I have seen with my own eyes. So this, quote, judgment apparently is going to bring a reconciliation between Yahweh and these nations and a full ingathering of these peoples into the clans and tribes of Israel. Basically, the most prized clan and tribe, that of David himself. So if we kind of understand what's going on in the beginning of the chapter, then that sets us up for how we should handle this prophecy that comes to us in Zechariah 9:9, or the second half of the entire chapter that we're looking at. So we're told here Zechariah 9:9, rejoice greatly. So this immediately comes after this proclamation. The Gentiles are going to be gathered in right alongside the ethnic descendants of Abraham who've come back as a remnant to Jerusalem. Rejoice, daughter Zion, and you should shout in triumph, daughter Jerusalem, because your king is coming to you. He is righteous, and he has salvation. Your translation may say something like, and he is victorious, but the literal Hebrew rendering is that he has salvation. And of course, we should recall the fact that salvation gains its definition in the song by the sea in Exodus 15. So throughout the Old Testament and bleeding into the New, the idea of salvation is the end of exile, beginning of Exodus, God rescuing his people from their enemies and giving them a new creation to go into where he is going to meet with them personally and dwell with them. That's always the idea behind the use of salvation. So he's bringing salvation, which would mean an end to exile, and of course the start of a new Exodus. Now, daughter Zion has the right to, of course, shout in triumph first because she should be the ones who recognize this king, because he has been preached and introduced to her through all the words of the prophets, going back now, to, of course, to the gates of Eden, but more prolifically through the words of men like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel, who've set timelines and have given us a good character, biopic or a portrait, a sketch of who Messiah will be, the things he's supposed to do. And of course, he's going to usher in a new age, a new covenant, and with that, God's kingdom. So when they recognize him, then they should be able to help their Gentile peers be able to recognize who Messiah is and what he's doing for them, because this exile-ending Exodus belongs to them as well. But what Exodus or exile have they been a part of? Being trapped under the boot of their Persian overlords? Not really. They have been under the same exile that all humanity has as sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, that being, of course, trapped in the bondage of sin. Humble, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the very foal of a donkey. So unlike most conquering kings who are riding aback some mighty, majestic steed that's been chosen for this occasion to make him look mighty, and of course as though he is filled with pomp, vitality, vigor, he is the conquering king who has just waylaid his enemies and their gods and all of these things. Instead, he's simply riding on the back of a donkey. Many have said in previous commentaries, this signifies the king is coming with peace, not with the idea of conquering in mind. But this picture is going to be swiftly reversed in a moment. Not so much with him switching up what he's riding on per se, but the idea of conquest is still in play. In fact, we're going to see that momentarily. But before we move on to the next point, we need to sum this up by recognizing that this reconciliation that we just talked about down here in Gathering of the Nations, this will come in the days of Messiah. So Zechariah is making that very clear. The reference to a king goes all the way back to the pre-exilic words of Isaiah, who says in Isaiah 32, there will be a king descended from David sitting on his throne, and his belt will be righteousness, and he will rule and judge righteously, and so forth. So Isaiah has made it clear there will be a king descended from David. And of course, this person is, as he says later on in the scroll, God's chosen servant in Isaiah 42. And that comes amidst the language of God talking about appointing Cyrus as a Mashiach or a Messiah, an anointed one. And Cyrus is a conquering emperor that rules over all kingdoms that God has handed into his hand. So Messiah will be just like that. He will be the potentate over all the kingdoms of the world. But of course, as the picture becomes more clear, it's not going to come through military might and conquest. Again, it's going to be through God handing him those kingdoms. Jeremiah picks up on this as well, and he refers to this king as a righteous branch. Ezekiel, no different. He calls this Messiah the Prince and or David. He just right out gives him that title, David, not son of David, as if he is David reborn or revivified. But of course, we understand this all the more because from Zechariah's standpoint, you only have his words. But when we get into the gospel accounts, we understand from the words of Matthew, who first introduces us to this, that this prophecy was fulfilled when Jesus was riding on the back of that donkey into Jerusalem to begin his Passion Week, which culminates with his enthronement as king. Now, what I mean is not his ascension. Of course, that is the ultimate moment of his enthronement at the right hand of the Ancient of Days, seated on the throne of his father David, ruling over heaven and earth together. but I mean his actual crucifixion. That was the moment the Jews lifted him up and exalted him as their king through the utter humiliation of the sacrifice they forced him to go through, or I should say, the death. So, of course, we're familiar with the verse. This took place that was spoken of by the prophet Zechariah, so that it might be fulfilled. Daughter Zion, see, your king is coming to you, gentle, mounted on a donkey, and a colt, the foal of a donkey. But now what's interesting is what comes in the verses that immediately come after this. So in verse 10, the bow of war will be removed, and he will proclaim peace to the nations. Bow of war being removed, that means exactly this. Peace has indeed arrived. Again, doubling back to the words of the pre-exilic prophets, this is exactly what we are told in Isaiah chapter 9. Behold, to us a son is born, and to us a child is given. The government shall be upon his shoulders. He will be called the Prince of Peace. Many more references that speak to the idea of Messiah being the one who will ultimately usher in peace. Now, before we're too quick to say, okay, got it, so the beginning of this started when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, but we're still waiting for peace to be proclaimed. That's not true. Jesus says to his own disciples in John, I give you my peace. And this is a peace that does not necessarily mean in its immediate outset all governments are going to immediately lay down their arms and stop fighting with each other. But it will happen systematically over the course of time as more people are brought into the kingdom. And as more people are brought into the kingdom, they become subject to Jesus' kingdom manifesto of Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are you when they revile you. And of course, if they attempt to try to smite you on the one cheek, turn the other. If they steal your coat, give them your cloak. If they tell you to walk 1 mile, go 2. Don't do anything to essentially rub your neighbor raw or seek to retaliate. Right? So with the idea in mind of that happening, sorry about that. Bye-bye, Nicholas. So with that in mind, what we have here is the understanding that peace is going to come in the days of Messiah's first advent as well. In fact, I think we can surmise that from Jesus' use of those words in Matthew 28:18, the Great Commission. Because all authority in heaven and on earth is given to him, he is going to be the one who ultimately will cause war to cease between these ancient powers that war against one another. And the truth is you see this happening in the book of Acts. After all, prior to the moment Jesus dies, you have his own disciples dealing with this rather scandalous notion that Jesus is talking to Samaritans, wants to travel through the area of Samaria, that he talks to this Canaanite woman who actually wants him to cast a demon out of her daughter. They considered these people to be basically dogs, and they weren't worth Jesus' time, much less their own. And yet, when we get into the book of Acts, we have a Jewish man by the name of Philip, anointed for a special office of ministry in Acts chapter 6, going about throughout the regions of Samaria and preaching, even as far away as Ashdod, Ashkelon, the former Philistine territories. He is bringing the good news of the arrival of God's Messiah, his enthronement as king, his rule and dominion over the world, and the invitation for these people who are not Jewish to enter into God's kingdom by simply coming to Christ and receiving redemption for their sins. So his dominion will extend from sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. And Jesus is not using futuristic language in Matthew 28. He's saying all authority is his at that moment. He has been ruling over this kingdom for the last 2,000 years, and it continues to expand. All right, 2 more things. Zechariah 9, verses 11 through 12. And as for you, because of the blood of your covenant, I will release your prisoners from the waterless cistern. So return to a stronghold, you prisoners who have hope. Today I declare that I will restore double to you. So here we have restoration coming apparently to Israel, because the idea of blood of your covenant here would seem to suggest this is a direct reference to the Abrahamic descendants who've come back to the land as a remnant, and that indeed we have this salvific language of release, releasing prisoners, returning to a stronghold, prisoners who have hope, and God giving back what it is that they've lost. And it goes right back up here to what we just read in Zechariah 9:9. Again, whatever your English translation may say, that he is righteous and is victorious, the Hebrew word here is salvation. Whatever the reason might be for translation committees choosing to use what word they did in place of salvation, nonetheless, if that's the true Hebrew word, we should understand the idea in mind here is that exile for Israel has finally come to its end. In the days of Zechariah, this exile has only slightly come to its end. What we're seeing here is God is beginning to repay what he said he would do through the pre-exilic prophets. He's caused the mind of Cyrus and his heart to be stirred to release these people. That's happened. They've went back. God is still fulfilling more promises by allowing them the resources of the nations, which he said he would give them, to rebuild the temple and the city. And now they have been resettled in the land. Zechariah is working through some of the obstacles that have come along the way. There's been cessation in the building of the temple for several years, but now that's been reignited. And Zechariah has made it very clear that Israel suffered during that 15-year hiatus or sabbatical in not building the temple, i.e. their crops were not growing and people were dying because of the fact they were paneling their houses with cedar rather than the house of the Lord, using the resources God meant for his house to be built with on their own houses and letting the temple lie fallow as nothing more than a completed system of a foundation to build upon. So the idea is that the temple needed to be built as a way of God saying, here's my down payment. This has all been done in spite of what you have done and what you have still failed to do, corporately repenting over your sin and coming back to me. I've still done all these things for you to show you I'm moving things forward. And the questions are being postured or posted to Zechariah in his day. Do we need to continue to fast and grieve because the temple was destroyed? It's been rebuilt now. If it's been rebuilt, is God going to bring Messiah now? And here's God's answer through Zechariah. The king is coming. Now, whether or not that's going to happen in their lifetime depends on their measure of obedience to God's covenant. And obviously it didn't. Hundreds of years later, Messiah would come. So the struggles are still present in Zechariah's day with respect to obedience to God with their whole heart. 100 years later, same thing with Malachi. I digress. Getting to our final point here. Oh, I forgot our reference here in Acts. So, again, releasing these people from exile. Well, this is what happens in the book of Acts. Even though Peter does not make a direct reference to the idea, but the concept is exile finally ends when Messiah has opened his arms and the gates to the kingdom and let the people come in. And this is exactly what we have with the mass ingathering of Jews in Acts 2 at the Feast of Pentecost, when Jews from all over the Roman Empire and beyond have made the pilgrimage to celebrate the High Holy Day. And thousands hear the proclamation that Messiah has come, was exalted by God through miracles and wonders, killed by their religious leaders, but nonetheless resurrected and again exalted by God to the very right hand of the Ancient of Days and ruling over his kingdom as was promised on David's throne. And then they are invited to repent and be baptized, meaning coming into this new covenant as worshipers of Messiah. This leads us to our last point, verses 13 through 15. So I will bend Judah as my bow. It's so crazy here, the reversal of symbols. Messiah coming on the back of a donkey, humble, not like a conquering king, but then, like a king does when he has conquered territory and ends war, he is saying, I'm going to put an end to war, hostility, and fighting and proclaim peace because he's conquered. How is he conquered? He's conquering hearts, not through military might. But then, while he is ending the use of war instruments by putting away the bow, yet he's going to use Judah as a bow. He's forming them into a weapon of war. And I will fill that bow with Ephraim, Ephraim being the largest of the tribes in the northern kingdom. So this is a symbolic reference to the idea of a joint work between Israel and Judah together as one united people again. I will rouse your son, Zion, against your sons, Greece, and I will make you like a warrior's sword. Then the Lord will appear over them. His arrow will fly like lightning. The Lord will sound the ram's horn and advance with the southern storms, because that's the call to always go into battle. The Lord of armies will defend them. They will consume and conquer with sling stones. Okay, so we're to make what of this? Is God saying that he's actually going to stir up the Jewish remnant to go to war against the Eastern European settlements of Greece, or the sons of Javan, and so forth? Is that what we're to understand, or is there something else here? Well, from the words of Zechariah in previous chapters, like chapter 2, verse 11, when we're talking about the one who comes to measure the temple, and he speaks to the concept of many peoples or Gentiles will come and gather alongside you and build this house. Or in Zechariah 6 with the skit of Joshua, the high priest, whose name is the branch, given a messianic title, crowned with a double-layer crown made of gold and silver. And he becomes the symbol of Messiah who will, quote, branch out from this place and build the temple. And again, a promise midway through the book of gathering all the nations together for the concept, or for the sake of this. If in two places already we've got a promise that the Gentiles are going to come in, now we've added a third reference to it in Zechariah 9, i.e. the first half of this chapter. We're not reversing that now to say that Jews are going to go out and conquer people. This is not a military conquest. It's a spiritual one. And again, we go back to Matthew 28 and the Great Commission, because Jesus is taking Jewish descendants of Abraham and he is sending them out to, quote, conquer the nations, as if Jesus is a new Joshua, the assistant of Moses, who carried out the conquest over Canaan, a new Joshua who was crowned king priest in the presence of Zerubbabel, Zechariah, Heldai, and many other nobles who saw this, and sending them out, telling them, make disciples. They are conquering the nations, not by putting people to death, but by rescuing people from death, bringing them to life by virtue of the Holy Spirit being imparted to them as they receive redemption for their sins. All of this here in Zechariah 9. I mean, it's a very quaint but beautiful picture of the gospel, the coming of the king and the ingathering of the nations, a proclamation of peace and the conquering of all the nations through a spiritual war that sees the casualties only being the spiritual entities that lose their power, while human beings are welcomed into right relationship with Yahweh. All right, so any questions on any of that before we end our time? All right, well, always, thanks for listening.